Good morning.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. You know, I mean, I've got some bad news. You're absolutely right to say that you expect dozens of councils to go the way of Birmingham. It would seem as though that is exactly what's about to happen. But you wrote this weekend about sort of how we lost our grip on the local council, or how the local council lost their grip on the local council. Tell us.
Well, it was all part of that strange Pied Piper dream time, really, of the late 60s and then the early 70s when it began to take practical effect. I remember I was 50 years ago now that I was working on my first local paper, and soon after I arrived there, the local council was transformed from what it had been, an ordinary borough council, into some strange new thing called a district council. The town clerk disappeared, all the old sort of brown lino, stringent and very tightly governed effects of old-fashioned local government seemed to vanish. It now had a chief executive with efficient glasses and a big new desk. Everything was surrounded by more and more verbiage, and he noticed quite quickly that more money seemed to be being spent, that things which people had been used to were vanishing. Local government in general became, I think, one of the places where the 60s student generation ended up. Now, there'd always been, really since the beginning of the 20th century, left-wing people had gone into local government to make changes, but they'd come up against very simple limits, let's say budgets. But around the same time, of course, the increasing subsidization of local government by central government made that much less tight. The whole basis of local government, that it spent what it raised in what were then called rates, began to disappear. And the politicization seemed to take place everywhere. Everything was a campaign of one kind or another. And also, you noticed that people would be, I'm not being specific here, but places where I live, you noticed that people would be given very substantial redundancy payments, and then shortly afterwards rehired. The cost of pensions for these and the size of salaries for local government increased. And as I say, it became simultaneously a place where a lot of money seemed to be rushing through the corridors in great rivers of gold, and where people could do practically anything, provided it was politically correct. The whole politically correct revolution, which overtook central government really in the 90s after the Blairite takeover, had begun in town halls and county halls in the previous decade. So it's been part of the decline of the country. Trying to explain it all, I used to wonder whether we had in fact put something in the water. And I came to the conclusion in the end that the most fundamental change which took place in that era, which I've written a book about, was the destruction of proper education. That proper old-fashioned conservative education, where the idea was that you, the pupil, learnt a defined type of knowledge from teachers who were very well educated and able to pass it on to you in disciplined surroundings, was just swept away. And once you did that, basically you have no restraints. Anybody can do what they like because nobody knows any better. And those who have determination to change the world can do it very easily. I think that was the pivotal change of the opening of the gates of the Cultural Revolution. And these things all happened round about the same time. The schools were destroyed in '65, and the rest of the country began to follow pretty rapidly in really the late 60s and early 70s in ways which were observable even back then, and accelerated hugely in the 1990s after the Blair takeover.
Yes, indeed. Because as you quite rightly say, most people probably don't know who their councillor is, and even worse, they have no clue as to how big the whole business of council-run offices has become, because there are literally dozens and dozens of people working on things that you don't even know about. Most of them now, a lot of them anyway, work from home. Some councils have even got to the point where they're using their offices so sparsely that they're talking about selling them off.
Well, it's very possible. Obviously, I know who my councillors are. But interesting thing, the city in which I live, Oxford, until these great reforms came in the 1970s, was something called the county borough, which meant it was run as if it was a county. Everything was run from the same town hall. Roads, schools, the whole lot was all run from the same place. Then in these new reforms, it was divided up between the city council and the surrounding county council. So if you rang either of them up and said, "Can you fix this?" they'd start saying, "Well, no, that's not us, that's the other lot." Yeah. And it became impossible to know who to turn to. And all the boundaries were redrawn. People stopped knowing who their councillors were. And one of the extraordinary side effects of this is that any member of parliament will tell you is that over the subsequent 40 years, their caseload of people coming to surgeries with problems hugely increased because people brought to them the kind of drainpipe stuff which used to be taken to local councillors, but they didn't know who their councillors were, so they went to their MPs. So MPs became, to a great extent, sort of social workers because of the fading interest in and knowledge of local government among people. I know it's a dull subject, you hear the words local government, but in fact it impacts on so many things.
Yeah. Well, do you know what I also put it down to, and you mentioned at your early stages of journalism working for the local paper, where people were training and working all the time. Some people never moved out of their local paper, and every single week they were down at the local courthouse covering various, incidents that might be minor but wouldn't make the national papers, in the same way they were covering council meetings. There is now no local paper, I believe, that actually sits in on council meetings anywhere in the country, so nobody even knows what's going on because it's not reported.
Is that true?
It's not read about.
It's shocking but not surprising, if you know what I mean. The decline of local newspapers, for those of us who worked in them, has been an astonishing thing. I know the first one that I worked on, for instance, had a full-time librarian with a huge archive and very carefully indexed library cuttings records going back probably for a century. And what will now have happened to that enormous archive and to the person who ran it? There were reporters there on the staff who were in their 40s and 50s who lived there all their lives, who knew their way intimately around the town, who knew everybody. I don't think that happens in most places anymore. Of course, council meetings and committee meetings and parish council meetings, and for heaven's sake, flower shows were covered. And above all things, because you can't really have justice if it's not seen to be done, the courts were covered. There was a day when 2 or 3 of us weren't down at the Magistrates' Court and the Crown Court covering the cases there. I'm not sure this happens anymore. And
it doesn't.
How on earth can we be sure that justice is being done?
Well, that's the exact problem, because, certainly in my experience, in every place that I've ever had to go and do a job, or in every place that I've ever sent anyone to do a job, you always used to say, go and hook up with the local guy and find out what he knows. Now there isn't one. There's literally nobody, because it became too expensive. Everything went online, and local newspaper reporting now is literally sort of puff pieces for people who want to try and get something in them.
Well, it certainly is a big hole in our previously functioning democracy, and it is one of the reasons why I think local government gets away with so much. I think they wouldn't have got away with what they get.
I mean, you describe
planning decisions that are taken that go without being criticised. Astonishing things.
Indeed.
All the time.
You describe the town halls as concrete corridors of mediocrity, and I mean the concrete thing, I suppose, for most people has become a kind of an absolute kind of totem pole, if you like, for what's gone wrong in Britain. Somebody thought it was a good idea to use a building material that would literally self-combust or self-destruct in 30 years.
It doesn't last. It's extraordinary. Again, this is one of the things about being fantastically old, is remembering in the 1950s, for instance, living in a rather lovely town in Sussex called Chichester. And it had a fine old brick and stone Victorian railway station. And they smashed it up and replaced it with this tremendously modern plate glass and tile and concrete job, which the last time I looked at it was absolutely shabby and miserable and crummy and hadn't lasted the course at all. Whereas if they left the Victorian one alone, it would still be standing and would be restorable. The decision to go for concrete in public buildings, for schools, offices, and courtrooms, everything, was a terrible mistake and doesn't seem to have had any real rational basis. We should have stuck with the older things to do. But everything that was new in that period was somehow given a free pass. If it was new, it was good. If it was new, it was automatically progress rather than change. And one of the great achievements of any human being is to be able to distinguish between change and progress. This change is bad, this change is good, not to automatically accept that because it's new and flashy, it's good. But we entered an era in which fewer and fewer people, because they were so poorly educated, were able to discriminate between the two. And so even to this day, people will say to you, but it's 2023, to excuse some stupidity, as if the fact that the calendar had altered had made something which was previously idiotic sensible.
Yes, it is a very good way of summing it up.